Welcome to Flipped Classroom. Today's lesson is about the definition argument. Arguments often revolve around definitions of crucial terms. So what happens when the word is either vague or controversial? When there's multiple definitions or it's used in different settings? Let's take this example with the word obscene. A couple sued Walmart after an employee turned in bath time photos at the photo lab, calling them obscene. In August 2008, Anthony brought more than 140 photos to be developed of Walmart. And in these photos, they were pictures of bath time of their three little girls, ages 18 months, 4, and 5 years old. The employee at Walmart thought the photos could be child pornography and called the police. And according to the police report, photos were of the children in provocative positions with their genitals exposed. If these pictures are truly obscene, the parents could go to jail. If they were merely fun family photos of kids, of siblings playing around in a bathtub having fun, then they're just innocent family photos. So determining obscenity versus fun family photos is a crucial term that needs to be determined in this case. A corrupt definition can really distort reality, as seen in the case with the word obscene. And also, here's two more examples. In the definition of an abortion, some people would say it's termination of pregnancy, while others would say it's murder of the unborn. Same with child abuse. Some people define spanking a child as child abuse, while others would say using an object to hit a child, such as a belt, would be child abuse. Judgments can create definitions, but definitions can also influence judgments. Definitions explain terms that are unfamiliar to the audience. So to make your definitions as clear as possible, you really want to avoid making them either too narrow or too broad. When a definition is too narrow, it really leaves out information that's necessary for understanding a particular word or term. For example, if you were going to define an apple as a red fruit, your definition is way too narrow, since apples are not just red. To be accurate and even useful, your definition needs to be more inclusive. It needs to acknowledge that apples can be red or green or yellow. An apple's round, edible fruit of a tree of the rose family, something a little more specific. On the other hand, a definition that's too broad, that's going to include things that shouldn't even be part of the definition. For example, if you define chair as something people sit on, your definition includes things that aren't chairs, such as stools and park benches and even tree stumps. So to be accurate, the definition really needs to be more specific. You also want to avoid circular definitions. That is when the word is part of the definition. For example, abstract art is a school of artists whose works are abstract. Or baseball is a sport where participants play baseball. In both cases, the audience is not given enough information. So where do you begin when trying to determine a definition argument? Think about how you're going to argue that something fits or even doesn't fit the definition of a particular class of items. And what are the characteristics of something in this class of items? So let's take a look at what I mean by class. In a formal definition, that's a dictionary definition, which aren't very good because they're too brief of explanations. So let's take the term dog. A dog fits into the class of domestic animals. And what differentiates a dog from other animals is it has a snout, keen sense of smell, barking voice, etc. Or let's say we're trying to define the term naturalism. That fits into the class of literary movements. And what differentiates that from other literary movements is that its followers believe that writers should treat their characters' lives with scientific objectivity. Now, these formal definitions are not enough. Your essay is going to have an extended definition, a more complex and detailed definition. And you need that because your terms are going to be much more vague and controversial than dog and naturalism. Here are some strategies for going about defining controversial, vague, or words with multiple meanings. The first is process, looking at steps that are involved. For example, if you're trying to define doctor-assisted suicide, you'd look at the steps involved. Does the doctor or the patient administer the drugs? This is good for legal matters when determining if the death is a murder, manslaughter, or assisted suicide. You can look at classification and division. Which group does it or does it not belong to? For example, if you're trying to define baby blues, would that belong in the depressive category where you need medical treatment, or just the sad category where maybe a scoop of ice cream, hug, and some coffee will help get you through the rough times? You might want to use exemplification. That's where you use examples and counterexamples. For example, trying to define police brutality. What is it and what is it not? Enumeration. That's where you would list its characteristics. Description, visual, sound, tangibles. This is really good for medical diagnosis. You might want to use synonyms, words with similar meanings, or analogies. You have comparisons. You might even want to look at the origins and development of the word. For this assignment, I'm going to ask you to use a characteristic thesis. You'll take a word, determine what class it belongs to, and then list 3 to 5 characteristics. So let's take a look at a firefighter. If I'm trying to define what is a hero, and I'm saying firefighters fit into the class of heroes, the characteristics would be because they are brave, selfless, and care about making the community a safer place. Since firefighters meet these 3 characteristics, a firefighter would fall into the category of heroes. On the other end, you might find that firefighters do not meet the characteristics of the class of heroes. For example, you might argue that yes, firefighters are brave and they do care about making the community a safer place. Yet they are paid to complete the job. And having an income is not one of the characteristics you list as being a hero. So think about why it is important to make the distinction between a genuine hero and someone who only has some of the characteristics. That's where you get into the critical thinking of your essay and the importance of coming to common definitions. You need justification. Why is it important to know the correct definition? Why is it important to know who's truly a hero and who's an employee that does heroic actions? Why are the alternative definitions wrong or hurtful, ineffective? And who does it impact? Let's take a look at the word torture. Torture is blank, blank, and blank. And it's important to identify an act of torture because I want you to think about that. There are many international policies based on torture. So if it's a teenager that says, wow, mom's torturing me by making me listen to her 1980s Madonna songs, is that really torture? As compared to someone who's in a war zone and is being electrocuted to try to get information? That's why it's important to have common characteristics to come to a conclusive definition. Here's your assignment. You're going to compose a 1,500 to 1,750 word definition argument in MLA format, and you're going to address one of the following prompts. The first prompt is a serious one. Are school shootings acts of terrorism or mental illness? If you choose not to do the serious prompt, you can do a little bit more fun prompt. Is Taco Bell junk food or a healthy meal? If you don't want to use Taco Bell, you need to use In-N-Out. And you have to use one of those 2 restaurants because they have a very specific menu that's different from other fast food restaurants. Before you begin writing, you should do some brainstorming. If you pick the first topic, you might want to do some basic research about school shootings. You might want to Google Columbine High School or Stoneman Douglas. And then think about, what are the characteristics of terrorism? You don't need to do research on this, just use common knowledge. What's the purpose of a terrorist act? What happens to people and structures during an attack? Where do terrorist attacks occur? And what do most people think of when they actually hear the word terrorism? On the other end, you should also look at what are the characteristics of mental illness. Again, you don't need research, you don't need doctors, medical studies. Use common knowledge. If you choose to do the second topic, do some basic research on what nutrients people need. You might Google the food pyramid or daily calorie intake. Then again, think about no research necessary, common knowledge. What are the characteristics of junk food? What ingredients are in a taco or burrito? What menu items have protein and vegetables and fruits? Are there good sugars and bad sugars in these foods? How's home cooking different than fast food cooking? This assignment is not meant to be a research paper. Basic research is fine, but relying on common knowledge is equally important. The next step is to develop your own definition. You do not want to use a dictionary definition. Those are way too simple. You don't want to use government definitions. Those are often too broad. Instead, on your own, pick 3 to 5 characteristics that you think would be a criteria for terrorism, or mental illness, or junk food, or healthy food. Here's an example for terrorism. I listed a whole bunch of words here: premeditated, emotionally scarring, violent acts, triggering fear, public places, destruction to property, causing death, revenge. Any of these characteristics might be criteria for terrorism. You only need 3 to 5 to match. You also need to establish your definition for this particular context. You need to stipulate. That's when you ask the reader to accept the definition that may be different than traditional ones. Other people in other contexts may define terrorism, mental illness, junk food, healthy food differently. You also might need negation, and that's where you have to tell the reader what is not your definition. How to structure this essay? There's a few different ways. Notice I have 5 Roman numerals, but that doesn't necessarily mean 5 paragraphs. Talking about 5 sections of your essay. The first section should be your introduction, where you're establishing context for your argument by explaining the need for defining the term and having your thesis statement. Then you'd have evidence where you provide the short definition of the term as well as your extended definition. This is where you're identifying the characteristics of the word being defined. The next section would be the evidence that explains how the term does or does not fit the definition by matching the characteristics. The next section should be your refutation. This is where you address questions about or objections to the definition and other meanings. And then you'd have your conclusion, where you reinforce the main point of the argument. It's where you include your critical thinking, your universal truth, your global insight. So here are your next